Most people think HOA is there to protect your property value. Until I opened my mail and found...
Our HOA president, Susan, didn't just want my money. She wanted me gone. She told me to pay up and...
But Susan made one massive mistake. She assumed I would just roll over. She didn't realize that in my day job...
Is how I use their own unbreakable rules to take down a criminal empire disguised as a neighborhood board.
I remember the day I signed the closing papers for my house in the Willows like it was yesterday. It was a crisp October morning, and the neighborhood looked like something out of a movie. Stately oaks lined the streets. The lawns were uniform, vibrant green, and there was a sense of quiet order that appealed to my soul. As a forensic accountant, my brain is wired for order. I deal with chaos and deception all day at the office. So when I come home, I want predictability. I want a world where the rules are clear, the boundaries are defined, and everyone respects the social contract. For the first 3 years, that's exactly what I had. Our HOA board was run by Bill, a retired Navy commander. Bill was firm but fair. If your trash can stay out an extra day because you were sick, he'd give you a call or a friendly knock. He understood that rules were meant to serve the people, not the other way around. But then Bill's health started to decline, and he moved to a specialized care facility in Florida. A vacuum opened up in our community leadership, and unfortunately, nature abhors a vacuum. That's when Diane moved in. She didn't just join the board. She staged a coup. She exploited a low-turnout election and brought in 2 of her friends to fill the other seats. Within weeks, the atmosphere in the Willows curdled. It started with the aesthetics. The welcome to the Willows sign at the entrance was replaced with a massive board of prohibited activities. But the real change was Diane herself. She bought a golf cart, white, with a flashing yellow light on top, and began her compliance patrols. I didn't think much of it at first. I'm a low-profile neighbor. I don't have loud parties. I don't have kids leaving toys out, and my house is a neutral beige that offends no one. I thought I was invisible. But in an HOA run by someone like Diane, being invisible is actually a target. It means you're quiet. It means you probably have a stable job and assets. It means you're a whale to be harvested. The first crack in my sanctuary appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my home office, elbow deep in a multi-million-dollar embezzlement case for a retail chain, when I heard the low hum of a golf cart idling outside my window. I peeked through the blinds. There was Diane, sitting in her cart, squinting at my house through a pair of binoculars. She was wearing a khaki vest with so many pockets, it looked like she was heading into a war zone. She scribbled something on a clipboard, snapped a photo with a long-lens DSLR camera, and drove off. I felt a weird prickle of anxiety, but I shook it off. I have nothing to hide, I told myself. 2 days later, a bright yellow slip of paper was taped to my front door. Not mailed, taped. It was a courtesy notice. Violation, mailbox verticality. Section 4. 2 of the CC and RS states all mailboxes must be perpendicular to the curb. Yours is currently leaning at an unacceptable angle. Correct within 48 hours or face administrative penalties. I walked out to the curb. I looked at the mailbox. I went back inside, grabbed a professional-grade spirit level from my toolbox, and placed it on the post. It was dead center. The bubble was perfectly between the lines. I took a photo of the level on the mailbox and sent a polite email to the HOA address, assuming it was a simple mistake or a calibration error on Diane's part. I never got a reply. Instead, 48 hours later, a second notice appeared. This one was orange. Violation. Failure to remediate. Fine, $100. Daily recurring penalty, $50. I was annoyed, but I figured I'd just wait for the monthly meeting to clear it up. I'm a man of systems. I trust the process. But the process had been hijacked. Over the next week, the notices started coming like a blizzard. Every time I came home, there was a new color on my door. Violation. Grass height. I had mowed it 3 days prior. Violation. Improper trash receptacle storage. The wind had blown my lid open by an inch. Violation. Unauthorized exterior decoration. I had a small, 4-inch stone turtle hidden under a hosta leaf in the backyard. How did she even see the turtle? She must have been peering over my 6-foot privacy fence. This wasn't about the neighborhood anymore. This was a targeted harassment campaign. I tried calling the HOA management company, a local firm called Beacon Property Group. The woman who answered, Cindy, sounded like she was reading from a script written by a hostage taker. We only process the paperwork Diane submits, sir. If she says there's a violation, there's a violation. We don't have the authority to override the president. But I have photos. I argued. I have a level on the mailbox. I have a ruler on the grass. She's lying. Sir, Cindy sighed, and for a second I heard a flicker of genuine pity in her voice. Diane is the board. If you want to fight it, you have to do it through the board. My advice? Just pay the fines. It's cheaper than the alternative. I hung up, my blood simmering. I didn't know what the alternative was yet, but I was about to find out. On the 30th of the month, the big one arrived. It wasn't a colored slip of paper. It was a heavy manila envelope sent via certified mail. I had to sign for it. I sat at my kitchen table, my hand slightly shaking, and tore it open. Final demand for payment. Account balance, $5,450. 00, I stared at the number. $5,450. For a mailbox that wasn't leaning, grass that wasn't long, and a stone turtle. The breakdown was a masterpiece of creative accounting. There were inspection fees of $250 per visit. There were administrative filing fees. There were legal consultation surcharges. But the most terrifying part was the bottom of the page, printed in bold, red ink. Notice of intent to record lien. If this balance is not settled in full within 14 days, a lien will be placed against a property located at 412 Oak Lane, pursuant to Section 12. 1. The HOA may initiate foreclosure proceedings to satisfy the debt. They weren't just trying to annoy me. They were trying to take my house. I looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the perfect lawns of the Willows. For the first time in my life, I felt unsafe in my own home. I realized that Diane didn't care about the rules. She was using the rules as a cloaking device for something much darker. Most people would have panicked. They would have dipped into their savings and paid the $5,000 just to make the nightmare go away. They would have sold the stone turtle and apologized for a mailbox that was already straight. But as I sat there, looking at that fraudulent invoice, my professional brain took over. I stopped being a scare homeowner and started being a forensic auditor. I looked at the font of the invoice. I looked at the lack of a corporate seal. I looked at the way the legal fees were rounded to the nearest $50, a common mistake made by people who were making up numbers on the fly. Okay, Diane, I whispered to the empty room. You want to play with numbers? Let's play. I went to my office and pulled out a fresh legal pad. I didn't start a defense. I started an investigation. Because if Diane was as comfortable lying about a mailbox, she was lying about everything. And in my experience, people who lie about the small things are usually trying to hide something very, very big. The days following that $5,450 demand were some of the quietest and most intense of my life. I didn't go outside to confront Diane. I didn't yell across the lawn. I didn't even call the management company back. In the world of high-stakes auditing, there's a concept called the quiet period. It's a time when the target thinks they've won, so they stop being careful. While Diane was likely celebrating my silence as a sign of my surrender, I was transforming my guest bedroom into a war room. I started by doing what every forensic accountant does when they smell a rat. I look for the leak. An HOA is essentially a small government. It collects taxes in the form of dues and spends that money on public works like landscaping and pool maintenance. If the taxes are going up or the fines are getting more aggressive, it's usually because the spending is out of control or someone is siphoning the reserves. I requested 5 years of the HOA's financial disclosures. Under state law, they have 30 days to comply. Diane, ever the gatekeeper, sent me a PDF that was so heavily redacted it looked like a CIA document. Entire columns of numbers were blacked out with a note. confidential vendor information. That was her first fatal mistake. In a nonprofit HOA, there is no such thing as confidential vendor information when it comes to the spending of the members' money. Every homeowner is a shareholder. We have a right to see every penny, every invoice, and every check. By redacting those files, Diane didn't hide the truth. She pointed directly at it. I spent 3 nights cross-referencing the unredacted portions with the few public tax filings I could pull from the county database. I noticed a massive spike in operating expenses the moment Diane took the presidency. The landscaping budget had tripled. Now, I looked out my window at our common areas. The grass was mowed, sure, but we hadn't added new flowers. We hadn't replaced the aging irrigation system. So, where was the extra $80,000 a year going? I started digging into the vendors. The landscaping was handled by a company called Evergreen Solutions. I looked them up on the Secretary of State's website. Evergreen was a legitimate, long-standing local business. I called them, pretending to be a new board member from a neighboring community, looking for a quote. "Hey, I saw the work you guys do over at the Willows." I told the sales rep, "It's top tier." I was looking at their annual report. "How do you guys manage such a massive contract? $120,000 a year for 200 homes is a lot of man-hours." There was a long pause on the other end. "Sir," the rep said slowly, "we don't have a $120,000 contract with the Willows. Our contract is for $40,000. We do basic mow and blow and seasonal mulching. We haven't raised our rates in 3 years." My heart hammered against my ribs. There it was, a $80,000 discrepancy between what the HOA was claiming to pay and what the vendor was actually receiving. But Diane wasn't stupid enough to just write a check to herself from the main account. She needed a middleman. I went back to the redacted files. I used a trick I learned early in my career. Sometimes, when people use a digital black marker to redact a PDF, they don't actually flatten the image. I exported the PDF into a raw text editor. The black bars disappeared, revealing the text underneath. The hidden vendor was a company called Hendricks & Associates. The line items were for consulting services, rule enforcement oversight, and legal liaison fees. Over the last 18 months, Hendricks & Associates have been paid exactly $79,500. It was the missing landscaping money, disguised as professional fees. Now, the hunt was on for Hendricks. I searched the state's corporate registry. The company had been formed exactly 1 month after Diane was elected board president. The registered agent wasn't Diane. It was a man named Robert Hendricks. I searched the name. No law license. No accounting certification. Just a guy with a LinkedIn profile that said consultant. I did a deep dive on Robert Hendricks' social media. It took me 4 hours of scrolling through friends lists and tagged photos until I found it. A photo from a wedding 6 years ago. There was Diane, looking younger and slightly less miserable, standing next to a man. The caption read, "So proud of my brother Bobby on his big day." Hendricks wasn't a legal firm. It was Diane's brother. She was funneling the neighborhood's reserves into her brother's bank account, and in return, he was likely kicking back a referral fee to her personal accounts. This was why my $5,000 fine was so important. Diane wasn't just being a Karen because she liked power. She was being a predator because she needed the cash flow. The $80,000 she'd stolen had probably depleted the HOA's emergency fund. If a pipe burst or the pool pump failed, the board would have to explain why there was no money. She needed my $5,000 and $5,000 from 5 other neighbors to top off the accounts before the annual audit. But as I kept digging, I found the illegal secret that gave my title its teeth. It wasn't just embezzlement. It was much weirder. To keep the HOA's legal status, you have to file a statement of information and pay a small fee to the state every year. Diane had missed the filing. The HOA's corporate status had been suspended by the state franchise tax board for over 7 months. In our state, a suspended corporation cannot legally enter into contracts. It cannot sue anyone, and most importantly, it cannot record liens on property. Diane was operating a zombie HOA. She was sending out legal threats on letterhead for a company that technically didn't exist in the eyes of the law. She was committing mail fraud every time she sent a notice of intent to lien. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the dual monitors reflecting in my glasses. It was 3 a.m. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and absolute clarity. I had the brother's name. I had the suspended status. I had the discrepancy in the landscaping contract. I looked at the final demand letter on my desk. 14 days. I had 12 days left before she tried to put a lien on my house. I could have called the police right then, but I knew how these things went. White-collar crime is low priority. It would take months for a detective to look at the file. By then, Diane would have seen the investigation coming and burned the records. No, I needed to let her keep going. I needed her to feel so confident that she would walk right into the trap I was going to set at the annual general meeting. I went to my kitchen and poured a glass of water. I looked out at the street. Diane's house was 3 doors down. Her lights were off, but I saw her white golf cart parked in the driveway, its little yellow light glinting under the street lamp. "Sleep well, Diane," I whispered, because in 12 days, the numbers are going to stop working for you. I didn't spend the next 12 days hiding. I spent them as the perfect victim. I walked my dog. I waved at Diane when I saw her patrolling. When she pointed at my mailbox and made a writing motion on her clipboard, I just nodded and smiled. I wanted her to think I was broken. I wanted her to think the $5,450 was coming. But behind the scenes, I was printing folders. I was making copies of the Secretary of State's suspension notice. I was printing out the brother's marriage certificate and the Evergreen Solutions invoice. I wasn't just preparing a defense for a mailbox fine. I was preparing a funeral for Diane's business. The 10 days leading up to the annual general meeting were the longest of my life. In the world of forensic accounting, we call this the pre-disclosure phase. It's a delicate period where you have all the evidence necessary to destroy a target, but you have to maintain a completely normal exterior. If the target suspects they are being watched, they destroy hard drives. They shred ledgers. They move money into offshore accounts or clean it through rapid-fire transactions. I had to make sure Diane felt like she was the apex predator of the Willows right up until the second the trap snapped shut. To keep her unsuspecting, I did something that felt like a betrayal of my own dignity. I sent her a letter. It wasn't a legal challenge. It was a request for extension. I wrote it on plain paper, making my tone sound desperate and overwhelmed. I told her I was struggling to liquidate the assets to cover the $5,450 fine and asked for an additional week beyond the 14-day deadline. I saw her the next morning. She was in her golf cart, idling at the end of my driveway. When I walked out to get the morning paper, she didn't just look at me. She smirked. It was a look of pure, predatory satisfaction. She had won. In her mind, I was the big fish that had finally stopped fighting the hook. She gave me a curt nod and shouted, "The board will take your request under advisement, Mike." But the late fees continued to accrue. As she drove off, I felt a wave of cold fury, but I channeled it into my work. I wasn't just working alone anymore. While I kept my public profile defeated, I began a series of midnight meetings. I didn't use email. I didn't use the community Facebook page, which Diane monitored with the intensity of a North Korean censor. I went door to door, but only to the people I knew had been targeted. First was Mrs. Gable. She was 82 years old and had lived in the neighborhood since the trees were barely taller than she was. Diane had been fining her $100 a week for chipping paint on her back porch, a porch that was hidden from the street and only visible if someone were to, say, trespass through the woods behind her house. Mrs. Gable was terrified. She was on a fixed income and had started skipping meals to pay the HOA. "Mrs. Gable," I said, sitting at her small kitchen table as she served me tea with trembling hands. "I need you to trust me. I'm an auditor. I've looked at the books. Diane isn't just a mean neighbor. She's a thief. I need you to show up to the meeting on Thursday. Bring every letter she's ever sent you." "I don't want any trouble, Mike," she whispered. "She told me if I didn't pay, they'd take my house. I have nowhere else to go." "She can't take your house," I told her, leaning in and looking her directly in the eye. She doesn't have the legal authority. The HOA is suspended. She's essentially a stranger on the street asking you for money. I'm going to stop her, but I need the neighborhood to see who she really is. If it's just me, she'll call me a disgruntled resident. If it's all of us, she's finished. By the end of the week, I had a silent committee of 14 neighbors. Each of them had a story that mirrored mine. Fake violations, aggressive administrative fees, and threats of foreclosure. We met in my basement, our voices low. I showed them the Evergreen Solutions discrepancy. I showed them the Hendricks & Associates shell company. I watched as the fear in their eyes turned into a burning, righteous anger. The most critical piece of the puzzle, however, was the secret. I had discovered that Diane wasn't just funneling money to her brother. She was using the HOA's reserve study as a blueprint for her theft. Every HOA is required to keep a reserve fund for future major repairs. Roofs, roads, the pool. Our reserve fund was supposed to have $400,000 in it. I had managed to get a voter list from the county, which included the names of every homeowner. I noticed something strange. There were 6 houses in the neighborhood, all of them currently vacant or in pre-foreclosure, that were listed as having voted yes on a recent special assessment that Diane had used to extract an extra $1,000 from every household. I drove to those houses. They were empty. One of them had a property of HUD sticker on the window. Diane hadn't just bullied the living. She was voting on behalf of the dead and the departed. She was committing identity fraud and voter fraud to pass her own self-serving motions. This was no longer just a civil HOA dispute. This was a criminal enterprise. As the night of the meeting approached, I prepared my evidence packets. I didn't make one copy. I made 200. I bought 3 new toner cartridges for my laser printer and spent an entire night collating. Each packet was a masterpiece of forensic storytelling. Page 1. The State of Illinois Notice of Corporate Suspension, the legal HOA. Page 2. The side-by-side comparison of the landscaping invoices, the theft. Page 3. The Secretary of State filing for Hendricks & Associates, the brother. Page 4. The forged special assessment ballots, the fraud. I felt like a general preparing for a final offensive. I knew Diane would have her defense ready. She would have her rules and her bylaws and her legal counsel. She would try to talk over me. She would try to cut my microphone. She would try to shame me as a bad neighbor who didn't care about property values. But I had something she didn't. The truth. And in my profession, the truth is an opinion. It's a mathematical certainty. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch, looking at the moon. The Willows were so quiet, so peaceful. It was hard to believe that beneath the surface of the suburban dream, a woman was systematically draining the life savings of retirees and families to fund a lifestyle she hadn't earned. I looked at my mailbox, the one that started it all. It was perfectly straight. It was perpendicular to the curb. It was a symbol of my refusal to let a bully win. Tomorrow, Diane, I said to the darkness. Tomorrow, the numbers come due. I went inside and checked my briefcase one last time. The packets were there. The USB drive with the digital presentation was there. The certified mail receipts were there. I was ready. I wasn't just a guy fighting a fine anymore. I was a forensic auditor on the hunt. And I knew that by this time tomorrow, the white golf cart with the flashing yellow light would be the least of Diane's problems. The night of the annual general meeting, the air in the community center was thick with a tension you could feel in your teeth. This wasn't just a neighborhood gathering. It was a powder keg. I arrived early not to take a seat, but to position my silent committee. My 14 neighbors were scattered throughout the room, each of them holding a plain, unmarked manila envelope. We didn't acknowledge each other. We didn't need to. The plan was already in motion. Diane was already on the stage, seated behind a long folding table with the other 2 board members, men who looked like they'd been bleached of all personality by her presence. Diane looked triumphant. She was wearing a sharp navy blazer and had a gavel sitting prominently in front of her. To her right sat a man in a charcoal suit. I recognized the type immediately. A high-priced fixer lawyer, hired with our own dues to ensure no one asked the wrong questions. As the room filled to capacity, nearly 200 residents, the largest turnout in a decade, Diane cleared her throat and slammed the gavel. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Order," she barked. "This is the annual general meeting of the Willows Homeowners Association. We have a packed agenda, including the approval of the new fiscal budget and the election of board seats. We will follow Robert's Rules of Order. Any outburst will result in immediate removal by the security officer." She pointed to a man standing by the door, an off-duty cop she'd hired to intimidate us. My heart was racing, but it wasn't fear. It was the cold, clinical adrenaline of an auditor who has finally found a plug in a multi-million-dollar leak. The meeting proceeded through an hour of mind-numbing bureaucracy. Diane read off achievements that didn't exist and thanked vendors who were overcharging us. Finally, she reached the open forum section. "We have time for exactly 3 residents to speak," Diane said, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "Each person has 2 minutes. I'll call on Mike first. I know he's been anxious to discuss his account." A few people chuckled. Diane smirked. She thought she was leading me into a trap where she could publicly shame me for my debt. I stood up and walked to the microphone in the center aisle. I didn't bring my briefcase. I just brought a single sheet of paper. "Actually, Diane," I said, my voice steady and echoing through the PA system, "I'm not here to talk about my account. I'm here to talk about the Special Projects Fund. I've been looking at the 1099s for a company called Hendricks & Associates. Can you tell the neighborhood why we paid them $79,500 last year for consulting?" The room went deathly silent. Diane smirked and vanished. It froze. It became a mask. "That's a confidential personnel matter, Mike," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "As I've told you in my emails, those records are protected. Please stick to the topic of your own violations." "It's not confidential when the money belongs to us," I countered. "And it's especially not confidential when the owner of Hendricks & Associates is your biological brother, Robert." A gasp rippled through the room. I didn't wait for her to respond. I signaled to my committee. At once, 14 people stood up and began passing out the 200 packets I had printed. "What are you doing?" Diane screamed, slamming her gavel repeatedly. "Security! Remove him. He's disrupting a legal meeting." The off-duty officer started toward me, but he stopped when he saw the first page of the packet. It was the official notice from the Secretary of State. I held a copy up for everyone to see. "You can't remove me, Diane," I shouted over the gavel, "because this isn't a legal meeting. As of 7 months ago, the HOA's corporate status was suspended. You have no legal authority to hold this meeting. You have no authority to collect dues, and you certainly have no authority to record liens. Every fine you issued in the last year is a violation of state law. You're not a president. You're a trespasser." The room erupted. It was like a dam breaking. Neighbors were standing up, flipping through the packets, seeing the side-by-side invoices of the landscaping fraud. Mrs. Gable stood up, holding her packet with a shaking hand. "You told me I'd lose my house, Diane," she cried out. "You took my grocery money for a brother who doesn't even live here?" The lawyer next to Diane leaned over and whispered something in her ear. His face had gone pale. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the exit. He realized that he was representing a client who had just been exposed for felony embezzlement in front of 200 witnesses. Diane tried to regain control. "This is all fabricated. These are doctored documents. Mike is a disgruntled resident who is trying to avoid paying his fair share. If they're doctored," I said, pulling out my phone and plugging it into a projector system I'd secretly coordinated with the AV guy, who also happened to have been fined for his non-compliant satellite dish, "then maybe you can explain this." On the massive screen behind her, a video began to play. It was a screen recording of my deep dive into the special assessment ballots. I showed the names of the vacant houses. I showed the timestamps of the votes, all cast from the same IP address. Diane's IP address. "That's identity fraud, Diane," I said, "and I've already sent a digital copy of this recording to the state attorney's office." Diane didn't scream this time. She sat down. Her face wasn't white. It was gray. The The two board members next to her stood up and literally walked off the stage, leaving her sitting there alone. The security officer stepped back, crossed his arms, and simply watched. He wasn't going to protect her anymore. The meeting didn't end with a gavel. It ended with a mass exodus of neighbors walking out of the building, clutching their evidence packets, talking about lawyers and police reports. I stayed until the room was nearly empty. Diane was still sitting at the table, staring at the back wall. "I'm an auditor, Diane," I said, walking up to the edge of the stage. "I told you the numbers don't lie. You spent 18 months trying to take our peace of mind. It's going to take you a lot longer than that to pay us back." She didn't look at me. She just gathered her gavel and her clipboard and walked out the back door. The aftermath was a landslide. Within 48 hours, the local police department's fraud division had opened a formal investigation. Because the evidence was so neatly gift-wrapped for them, they didn't have to spend months digging. They executed a search warrant on Diane's house on Saturday morning. They found the Hendricks and Associates checkbook in her desk drawer, along with $12,000 in cash tucked into a shoebox. The legal revenge was total. A judge issued a permanent injunction against the HOA board, freezing all assets. Every single fine issued during the suspension period was wiped clean. The liens were removed from our titles at Diane's expense. She took a plea deal to avoid a 10-year prison sentence. She got 5 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, ironically picking up trash in city parks, and she had to pay back every cent of the $450,000 she'd stolen. To do that, she had to sell her house in the Willows. The day she moved out, there was no flashing yellow light. There was just a U-Haul and a woman who looked 10 years older than she had a month ago. As she drove past my house, I was out at the curb, painting my mailbox a slightly different shade of black. Just because I could. We have a new board now. It's led by a retired teacher who actually listens. Our dues went down by 40% because, as it turns out, when you aren't paying for the president's brother's lifestyle, suburban maintenance is actually quite affordable. People ask me why I didn't just pay the $5,000 and move on. They say it would have been easier. But as I look around the Willows today, seeing Mrs. Gable sitting on her non-compliant porch and kids playing yards that aren't being measured with a ruler, I know I made the right choice. Bewleys like Diane rely on the idea that the little guy is too tired or too busy to fight back. They rely on the complexity of the rules to hide their crimes. But they always forget one thing. The truth has a way of balancing the books. And in the end, everyone pays what they owe.